And we've got a file to download today. So what are we on, March 9th? Working with pivot tables. Let's go ahead and download this university crime data. This actually is an aggregated form of the data that those data files that we worked with last time. Remember how those data files were one for each state, and it said how, at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities campus, there was 4 cases of arson, 2 cases of murder. I don't know how much murder there was. Hopefully none. But yeah, so this data file then that we've downloaded here is all that data now just organized into a single table of data. So each row gives us information about one of the numbers in that table that we got from the Excel book. So here this says, Auburn University in the state of Alabama in 2006 on the Montgomery campus, we had crime. The crime was auto theft, and there were 0 known incidents of auto theft. In fact, Auburn looks like a pretty good place to go to school. What do we got? We got 8 cases of larceny in 2006 for enrollment of 5,000 students. What's this next one? A lot more. We got burglary, a lot more larceny, double the size of school almost, but who's this? Jacksonville State University. Anyway, that's what the data is that we're working on. And so today, what we're going after today is we're looking at building pivot tables with VBA. So used to be, when I started teaching here kind of early 2000s, 2007, 2008, very few students had any exposure to even what a pivot table was. Now I'm expecting, you guys have all made pivot tables. Raise your hand if that's true. Made pivot tables, got familiar with pivot tables, okay. So today is not about making pivot tables. Today is about what does it take to automate that process. And it's another one of these things where if you record it and then kind of look at the code that you record, you think, oh my gosh, what has happened here? It ends up recording in a way more complex way than is necessary. So our goal today is we're going to build a pivot table from scratch. We'll throw it away. Then we'll record ourselves building that same pivot table. And then we'll go take a look at the code and see how we can improve it. So let's just go ahead. So I'm just going to select a single cell inside this data. I remember the very first time after they switched over to Excel 2007, which is when we got this ribbon kind of interface, looking around for where did they move the pivot table. And for some reason, I thought pivot table is kind of an advanced thing. It's going to be off over here to the right. I just never even looked in the very first square of any of the, took about a half hour to find it, but here it is, right here, pivot table. So insert, I'm just going to make a pivot table. It's defaulted to the right range. That looks good. I'll put on a new worksheet that also looks good. All right, and what am I going to do? Let's go ahead and bring, we're definitely going to want the value to be what our value is. So we'll put that down here, and sum of value should be okay. Oh, bye. So what does that number mean by itself? That number by itself means absolutely nothing. And the reason is because we've got 2 different kinds of data here in the values. We've got some data that's informational and some that's report of crime. So that's like the sum of every number in this column, which is all the crimes plus all the enrollment, which is a number that I think is absolutely worthless. So let's give it some context. So in the columns, why don't we go ahead and put the label as the column. Okay, so this looks a little bit better. So now that number tells us, across this entire data set, we've got 1,706 incidents of arson reported, 6,500 assaults. The total enrollment across this is huge. How big is that? Just want to put some commas on that so I can see it. 30 million? Got 30 million people enrolled in college? No, because this is multiple years. And so there's going to be a lot of double counting happening here. So the enrollment here in 2006, there'll be a 2007 for Auburn. It's going to have an enrollment, approximately 3/4 of that number is going to be overlap. So 3/4 or maybe a little bit less. The students that are counted one year are counted the next year. So as is always the case when you're doing any kind of data analysis, is make sure you understand what data is kind of going into the numbers that you're summarizing. All right, so what else are we going to put? So let's put as our rows, let's put, shall we say, the state first, and then we'll put the school, and then we'll put the campus. And then why don't we put the report year as a filter? This is a pretty reasonable pivot table now. So we've got all the years, but we can filter this down just to look at, say, 2010. Now we're looking at the 2010. So that really is now kind of the enrollment, at least across this data set, of schools that are reporting their crime to the FBI. About 113,000 students enrolled across the 48 states that are represented here. Let's see, I probably don't want this whole thing built out, so maybe I'll collapse this so it's a little more readable to start with. So I think I'm just going to click here where it says row labels. Hide field list, is that what I'm after? No, I didn't want to do that. Show field list. Oh, maybe I click on Alabama. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to click on one of these and I'm going to do the collapse, expand collapse, and collapse entire field. There we go. So that gives me a pretty good looking summary table. I can drill into it. I want to come here and look in Utah. We want to compare, what's going on in Utah here. And let's see, which is my, got arson, assault, auto. If we look here, we have a hard time competing against the University of Utah. I mean, they got way more crime than us. I don't know how we're ever going to catch up. Whatever this is, they just got lots more than we do. But the one place that we seem to perform better than them is arson. Is that right? 2010, we had one arson. They didn't have any arson. So we got to pick our comparisons where we can. All right. So that's the pivot table that I would like to record ourselves making. So I'm going to go ahead now and just delete this sheet, and we'll go through that same process again, but this time we're going to be recording it. So turn on my developer tab, record macro. I'm going to call it make pivot table. Sure, hotkey Control Shift P. So I'll put a capital P in there. Say OK. And I'll go that same process again. Insert pivot table. We get onto a new sheet. That's great. Bring the value down to values. For the rows, I'll put school. No, I want state first. State, then school, then campus. The column, I want the label and report year for a filter. And then I'll come over here, right click Alabama and choose expand collapse, collapse entire field. And after we get this one built, we may record ourselves doing a few more things to even do a little more customization on this. So I think I'm ready to stop recording. All right. And let's go take a look at the code. Seems like there should be some code here. Oh, I need to see my Project Explorer. So view, Project Explorer. And should have a module 1. There we go. So here's make pivot table. And wow, there's just a kind of a lot here. Now you'll remember that when we recorded ourselves doing charts, there was kind of two things happening at once. It would like create the chart and then it would activate that same chart. And then kind of work with what the active chart was. We have something similar happening here. And so sheets.add, it's adding a sheet. Let's go ahead and begin by getting a reference to that sheet. I'm not sure what I'll want to do with that sheet, but let's actually capture a reference to that added sheet. So let me dim S as a worksheet. And then we'll set S equal to this. I'm not sure that we're going to want to do anything with that sheet, but now we have a direct reference to that sheet. We could rename it. Trouble with renaming it is we'd have to rename it to something that would be different each time. So I'm just going to kind of capture that. And then here then is the statement that actually creates our pivot table. And you can see the create pivot table method kind of right here in the middle. So it says, hey, great, from the active workbook, we've got something called pivot caches. Anytime I see an object that's named in the plural, I immediately want to think this is probably a collection like worksheets or the workbooks or even the charts collection, shapes collection. Those are collections. I don't even know what a pivot cache is. Well, I do, but like the first time I read this code, I had no idea what a pivot cache is. And let's see. So you guys have some experience working with pivot tables. Have any of you ever built a pivot table for data that wasn't even stored in Excel? Like you're connected onto a database and you're building the pivot table in Excel right off of the database. Looks like we have one person who's done that. So, so yeah, pivot tables are fantastic, and you're not limited to data that's just, sitting here in Excel. And so kind of step one when you're making a pivot table is Excel has to say, well, look, let me get this data into a format that I can really work with to manipulate. And it doesn't matter if the data is sitting in a text file, if it's sitting in a database somewhere else, if it's sitting here in Excel. There's lots of other places. I can't think of any other places straight off the top of my head, but lots of other places the data could be sitting. And so step one is saying, listen, let's just get the data cached. And then once we get that data cached, we can build multiple pivot tables off that same pivot cache. And so that's what this pivot caches object is. It's the collection of all the pivot caches in the active workbook. So I should be able to say pivot caches dot count. So pivot caches dot count, and maybe I have to say active workbook in front of it, or this workbook or something. There we go. So I've got one pivot cache here. Okay, so that's good, but you'll notice that this code just says, hey, create it. So I'm a little worried here that I'm going to end up creating multiple pivot caches when I really only need a different pivot cache for each different data source that I'm using to build multiple pivot tables on. So it's kind of good to kind of understand this, that we've got a collection here. I can ask how many there are. It means that if it's a collection, it means I can refer to it by its ordinal position as well as by its name. So I should be able to say pivot caches one dot, oh, there's no name. Pivot caches one, at least I can ask for what the type name of that is. There's a type name function that whatever you give it just tells you, is that a string, is it an object, is it a workbook or whatever. It tells me it's a pivot cache. But the point is I can refer to it by its ordinal position that we have here. Now, we then see that there's this create pivot table method. So that create pivot table method is a method of what kind of object? Is it a method of the workbook? Is it a method of the application? Is it a method of a range, of a chart, of a sheet? What is it a method of? Say it again, create. So create's going to be, you're looking at this create right here. So this is a method of the pivot caches object, or the pivot caches collection. And so this is saying, hey, I want to create a pivot cache. And so right up to this parenthesis right here, that's going to evaluate to a pivot cache that was created by this create sheet, by this create method. And so this, what we have here, is going to create a pivot cache, and it's going to return a reference to that newly created pivot cache. It creates that object. It kind of gets that data all organized, or it at least, I think it does organize that data into that pivot cache. And then it's saying we want to use that cache to create a pivot table. So create pivot table is a method of the pivot cache object class, which means that I'm going to want to be keeping track of two different things here. One is a pivot cache and one is a pivot table. So like when we built the chart, it built a sheet and put a chart in it. It's kind of similar here. We're first building a cache, and then we're using that pivot cache to build the pivot table. So let's go ahead and declare those two variables, and we're going to capture the references to those. We're going to capture references to the objects that those create. So let me dim PC as a pivot cache, and let me dim PT as a pivot table. Okay, so here I'm going to say I want to set my pivot cache equal to right up to the point where it has created that pivot cache. The whole reason that after this part I have highlighted, I can say dot create pivot table is because this is going to refer to a pivot cache. So instead, I'm just going to end that statement there. And now I'm saying, hey, create the pivot cache, and let's remember where that pivot cache is. So now I want to come here and say, oops, come back to the beginning, set my pivot table variable equal to, And then what do I have to put right here? Yeah, my PC, I put my pivot cache. So before I did it directly, create the pivot cache dot, and then immediately execute the create pivot table. No. Now I'm saying, let's create the pivot cache, remember where it is, and then use that object to create the pivot table using the create pivot table method. Now you'll notice that on this create pivot, this create statement for the pivot caches, I already had parentheses around the argument list. And that's because I was doing something with the value that came back. That was a reference to an object and I was calling a method of it. But this one, I wasn't doing anything with it. And so there's no parentheses around the argument list, but now I am. I'm capturing the return value, putting it into a variable. So I've got to put parentheses around the argument list. Okay, so now I've kind of done the mechanical part of building this, kind of separating that into two different statements. Now let's see if we can go ahead and generalize it. And the whole reason that we would want to automate this is if we think about what that database project is, the one that's coming up, is you got to read in all the new files for the new crime data and then get them imported. And then presumably we're going to want to build a pivot table on that new data. So we don't know how big the data is going to be that we need. We can't just refresh the pivot table because this pivot cache is built on a specific range, right? And so if we add more data to the bottom of that table and then just refresh the pivot table, I don't get that data coming in. So we've got to make this dynamic. Now, this is the source data, and we can see that it is bringing in a string. We could just kind of format this string, but it's really, really common in objects in VBA that if you've got a string that references a range, you can just put a reference to a range in that space. And that's what we're going to do here, because it's going to be a lot easier for us to get the data that we want by using a range than trying to get the whole address to that range. What's going to be a really quick way for me to get like the whole range of contiguous data from here? There's a method of the range object that says, just give me the contiguous data. Current region, yeah, it's called current region. So if I come here to A1 and just say, give me the current region, it's the same as hitting Control star on my keyboard. That selects the current region. And so right from here, range 1 on my crime data sheet, you go ahead and look, did I name it? Yeah, this is actually called data. So I can see right here that the label says crime data, the name of the sheet is actually data. So instead of having that string there, I'm going to say data dot range A1 dot current region. And so that will say, yeah, just give me the contiguous set of data from A1. And so however much we append onto the bottom, the next time we run this, that's what we're going to get. Okay, so that looks pretty good. A little bit worried that we're going to be creating multiple copies of this. So we might have to add, kind of creating more pivot caches than we need to. So we'll take a look at that the next time we run this, see if it does generate more pivot caches. Might be smart enough to look at it and go, oh, we already got a pivot cache on that one. Instead of making a new one, we'll use the existing one. I'm not sure. We'll take a look at that. But it looks like we have to do some customization on our pivot table as well. So what part of this looks bad? Right there, it's got a sheet name built into it. So again, we could probably put this as a reference, actually as a reference to a cell, or why don't we just do it this way? The row 3, column 1 looks okay. And I know what the name of my sheet is because I've made a variable called s. So let me just say s.name and concatenate that on. I probably could say s.range C1, column 1, range 3. It's always tough for me to convert these back and forth. Row 3, so that's A3. So I could say, just put this in A3, but I think this will work okay. Ooh, pivot table name is going to be a problem. That name is going to have to be unique, I think. Or maybe it just has to be unique on the sheet. I'm not sure. But if I don't tell it a name, turns out the name's optional. If I don't tell it a name, it's going to calculate a name for me. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that one. Truth is, I don't even know what this default version means. You don't have a different default besides 6. You've got 7. Oh yeah, probably you're on Office 365, and I think I'm languishing here in Excel 2019 on this computer. So a little different version. I think that's going to be okay. I think if I try to change mine to 7, it wouldn't work. I'm sure you guys could change yours to 6, but let's just leave it as it is. In fact, it's short enough now. I think I'll go ahead and bring this up onto the same line. Okay. What else we have going on here? Sheet 2.select. Again, we could say s.select here because that's a reference to my active sheet, but it's already the active sheet. I don't know why it recorded select. When we added the sheet, it became the active sheet. So I'm going to get rid of that line altogether. And so we're now selecting. I don't think there's any reason to select that cell either. So I'm going to get rid of that one. Okay. Now let's take a look at this. Looks like we're setting up a bunch of default properties for this pivot table. Active sheet.pivot tables, pivot table 2. What object is that identifying? What's that? So actually, yeah, this is identifying the pivot table that we just created. Well, it's no good anymore because the name is wrong, but we have captured a reference set, so we can replace that with PT. I'm not sure we're going to keep much or any of this code. Let's just take a look at it. So all of these things that's saying, we're going to have the grand column is true. I didn't set up any of these things, which makes me think these are probably just all the default values. Did I make any changes to any of this? Calculated members in fields, show values, row, field list, ascending. I think these are all defaults. It wouldn't hurt to leave them here. Whoops, that should be PT. It wouldn't hurt to leave them here, but because they're defaults, I think, you know what? I'm going to get rid of them. I can always record this again and bring it back if it doesn't look right after I delete it. Or maybe I'll just comment it out or copy it and put it over Notepad or something. But again, I think that was just giving me default values. If I had done a bunch more configuration that manipulated those, I might want to be a little more circumspect in which ones I deleted, but I think we're okay. Okay. Let's take a look at this next one and see if we can understand it. Got another with block. So we're doing a bunch of stuff with some object. And it looks like we're doing some things with the pivot cache that's associated with that particular pivot table. Well, I think before I even think about keeping these, and again, these are probably defaults, I can just say, hey, I've got a direct reference to my pivot cache. I can just say PC. Refresh on file open false, replace, and again, those are defaults, but they're small enough, and I'm not sure how much more we're going to do with our pivot cache object for now. I'll go ahead and leave that one in here. Okay, now anytime I see active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2, I should just be able to replace that with PT. So that's saying repeat labels. I'm not quite sure what that means. Get rid of this one. Add data field. Now we're getting somewhere. Repeat all labels. Okay, let me look at this. This is broken onto 2 lines. I'm going to, now that my identifying the pivot table is shorter, I'm going to bring that up onto 1 line. I think we'll be able to see it all. Okay, let's see if we can understand what this line is doing. So it says I'm calling the add data field method of my pivot table object. And now this is active sheet pivot tables 2. That's my PT again. It looks like it's adding a data field and it's getting one of the fields of the pivot table. There it is. It's taking the value and it's making it, it's making the data field. So it's saying my data field is going to be the value field. If I didn't like it called sum of value, I could change it here. I'll just call it total. And it's going to be a sum, not an average or the minimum, maximum value or the standard deviation. It's going to be the sum. We're making this code quite a bit more readable. Now, here we've got state, school, and campus. So here's where we're putting in, what are we doing here? So there's the pivot table fields, state. So what we're doing is we're saying that this pivot field is going to be a row header, and it's going to be in position 1, This one's going to be in position 2. This one's going to be in position 3. My hunch is that they're going to go in that order if I add them in that order. So I don't think I actually have to say position 1. So really all I have to do is change the orientation of that, which makes me think I don't really need a whole with statement for that. So let's simplify this. I'm going to change this, including the with, down to just say pivot table, PT, bring up the orientation, and then get rid of the next lines. So that's making state one of my row headers. And I may just, might be a simpler way forward just to copy that line and just do that to my other 2 columns. So we're setting the orientation of all of those to be those rows. Don't need to worry about the position. It'll default to the order that I enter them in. So we can get rid of that code. We're getting rid of more code than we're keeping here today. And so this one is similar. This is which one? So here's where I'm saying make my label the column field. So same thing here. PT. Bring up my orientation, delete the next 2 lines. And again, same thing with our report year. Ooh. We're selecting A5. I don't think there's a good reason to select A5. And then, oh, here's where we collapse everything. So again, let's get us down to our pivot table, PT. Pivot field state, show detail equals false. I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Tell me, help me find it. Thank you. Anything else I did wrong? Well, let's give it a shot and see what it does. I'm really kind of interested. I mean, I do this example exactly once a year or twice a year, and I really don't remember if it's going to regenerate another copy of this pivot cache. So I'll be interested to see how many pivot caches we have after I run this again. So I'm going to leave my 1 pivot table in place, and I'm going to come back to my data, and I hit Control F, Control Shift P to execute that. And let's see how it looks. It looks pretty good. State, school, and campus. Thanks for helping me get that right. I got my total here, and label report year looks pretty good. So yeah, mission accomplished. Now I'm curious to see how many pivot caches we have. And let's print that out. It did create another pivot cache. That's bad. Because now I have 2 different pivot caches built on exactly the same set of data. And the whole point for a pivot cache is to say, this is the data now organized, ready to build pivot tables off of. I'd much rather build multiple pivot tables off that same pivot cache than have to duplicate that object. So what's that? Yeah, we're going to just kind of check to see if we need to build it. All right, so let's see. Here's where I'm creating that pivot cache. So let's come in here and add a little more logic around this. So I know I'm going to have to create that pivot cache if there are no pivot caches in the workbook. So let's do this. Let's say if if this workbook dot pivot caches dot count is equal to 0. then, stand by for just 1 second. I think what we'll do is we're gonna end up creating this if we can't bind on to the existing one. So let's do this. Let's say if there's more than one, if there's more than 0. So if it's greater than 0, then I think what we want to do is let's start off by just, I think we want to get a little more sophisticated here. But if there is a pivot cache there, let's just assume that the first pivot cache is the one that we're after. We could get more sophisticated at that if you'd like to. But if there is a pivot cache there, then let's just set our pivot cache variable equal to the first pivot cache. Else, set the pivot cache variable equal to a newly created one. Our whole point here is to say we might be adding more data into it. And so there's already a pivot cache and we've added data. We want to be smart enough to go and get that new data. So let's see if this works. And if so, we'll add some more logic to make that go. So we've got 2 pivot caches right now. I'm going to make another, I'll make another pivot table. Back to crime data, Control-Shift-P. And let's see if we still have 2. So we'll ask for our count here. We still have 2. Okay, so successfully built that using my existing pivot cache. I'm wondering if we can just delete that. I don't know. Let's give it a try. Pivot caches. We only need 1 here. Pivot caches 1 dot. Is there a delete or remove? So refresh. Maybe it's pivot caches dot remove. I don't know how to delete a pivot cache. Count, create, creator, parent. There's got to be some way to do it. I'm not sure. We only got 2. That's pretty good. We'll live with that. Okay, so now what are we going to do if we need someone to be able to tell if that pivot cache that we found actually is built onto the same range that we know that we need. And so let's think about how we might do that. Any suggestions on what we might do to make this a little more sophisticated, to say, let's take a look and see if we find one that is the data that we're expecting. I don't know either. I wonder what options we have for a pivot cache. Let's take a look here. I probably still have it on the clipboard. Pivot caches sub1 dot. We have a record count. Now that might do it for us. But why don't we do this? Let's say we look across the pivot caches that we have in this workbook. And if we find one that has the right number of records, we'll use it. If we don't, something's changed and we probably should build a new pivot cache off that current region. All right, so instead of just if there's more than one here, why don't we make a loop that looks across all of them? That shouldn't be too tough. Okay, so I'll declare another variable here. We could either do a for next loop or we could do a for each loop. Which one do you think is better situated to this? For next, where you have a variable that's going to count from 1 to the number of elements we have in that pivot cache collection, or a for each loop, which is just going to kind of iterate across those objects. Two different questions here. Which one would you be more comfortable doing, for each or for next? Who says for next? Just give me an integer and I can work that. A little simpler. Who says, no, I'm more comfortable with for each? Anyone there? A lot of folks not showing up to the polls. I actually went to my party's precinct meeting last night, caucus meeting. There were 11 of us there. It was really poorly attended. So I have a lot of apathy towards voting all around, I guess, today. So we probably should be using the for each. It's really what it's designed for. I want to go across each of these elements and look at each one individually. That's what the for each loop is made for. So let me go ahead and set up another variable. PC is going to be the one that I'm actually using, but I'm going to want a different variable. In fact, maybe I'll just do it as an object. So dim, I'm going to call it pivot cache. That's probably a bad name. Call it PVT cache. And I'll go ahead and declare this as a pivot cache object. So I'm now going to say for each pivot cache in this workbook pivot caches. Next. So now let's do this. Let's say if the one that we're looking at, so if the current pivot cache that we're looking at dot, was it row count? Record count? There it is, record count. If pivot cache record count, it's going to be a number, is equal to, now we got to figure out how many rows I should have, how many records I should have. I'm looking at my data. I don't think it's going to count the headers here. So how could I know how many rows of data I should be expecting here? Well, I could do the same thing to get to the current region from A1, ask how many rows there are in that range, and take one off of it. And I like that because I already got the code written somewhere that gets that. I forget where it was though. Somewhere we said current region, here it is. So with that record count, in fact, maybe before I do that, let's just print that off. So I'm going to print that record count and put a stop in here. Let me run it to there, and that should print the two numbers. I can make sure I'm getting after the right number that I want. So there's 23,163. So I'm expecting this to be on 23,164. Yeah, so I think we were exactly right. You can count the number of records in that range, subtract one, and if it's got that number, that's the one we're after. So we're going to say if that is equal to the current region from that set dot rows dot count minus 1. Then we're going to set our pivot cache equal to that control variable. And there's no reason to keep looking, so let me exit 4. So who knows? But we might get some other pivot tables built on completely different data sets. It'd be strange if it had the same number of rows. We could probably do a little more sleuthing to make sure we're on the right data set, but let's leave it at there. Let's leave it there. So now, if I've hit this line, pivot cache is going to be bound onto something. If I make it through this loop and pivot cache isn't bound onto anything, I think I'm going to need to create the pivot cache. So let me come down here to my if statement. And we won't be binding on, so we're gonna need to look at something and say, if that is true, then bind on to this, create a new pivot cache and bind onto it. So how can we tell if the pivot cache, a pivot cache variable, PC variable, actually got bound on, if we actually hit this line? We could make another variable that just like a true or false, a Boolean variable that we could set to true if we hit this. But I think we can look at the variable and know for ourselves. So it turns out that anytime you create an object variable like this worksheet or this pivot cache, are all object variables. When they're created at this point, they start off being bound onto a special variable called nothing. And we can check to see if it's bound onto nothing. If it gets attached here, it won't be bound to nothing anymore, it'll be bound onto that pivot cache. So I can say if PC is nothing. So nothing is a special object. It's the only object with neither properties nor methods. It's just an object. And when you're checking for equality between two objects, are these two objects referring to the same object, these two variables referring to the same object, then you use is to do it. That's what is does. It compares equality between objects. So PC is going to start off at nothing. It's a default value for all object types. If I make it past this loop and it's still nothing, we didn't bind onto it. We need to bind onto it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right here because I am expecting when I run this that PC will be bound on. In fact, maybe I'll stop here too. And let me run this. Okay, so I haven't done anything yet. I've set S to something, but I've just got my PC hasn't been manipulated. So I should be able to say type name of PC, and it should tell me that it's nothing. I'm going to run to my next stop and ask for the type name of PC. And now it's a pivot cache. So we know that we bound onto it here. So PC is nothing should return false, and I should skip right past that block of code. So now that looks pretty good. We're looking across all the pivot caches in this workbook, and we're saying, it looks like we found the one that's got the data that we're after. If we add more data or take more data away from this, then it'll build that different pivot cache. Here's proof. We take that stop out, take this stop out, stop this. We're not changing the pivot cache, but let me change the data that we're comparing it to. I'm just going to delete one line off of this. Sheridan, you had 0 robbery in 2010. Good for you. We're taking that line off. So that's going to give me one less row in my set of data to compare. So I think this is going to create a new pivot cache. You want to step through it or just run it and see what the pivot caches are? Let's just run it. Control-Shift-P. I've got my pivot table. Let me count my pivot caches. This workbook pivot caches. I'm not expecting to see 3 here. And it's made a new pivot cache. So that's what we're hoping for here. Look at the data. If it's got a different number of rows, looks like we've got to build a new pivot cache for it. Okay, let's suppose that what I'm doing here is I'm really looking for, let's see, is there a way to hide these? I forget how to hide. Hide field list, no. Collapse, group, ungroup, move, remove state, field settings. There's a way for me to make this invisible. You guys know pivot tables. How do you do it? It's under field settings? No. I don't remember. hide row in pivot table. Activate the pivot table, click the category label, then click the label again. Oh, that says IBM. That's bad. And it's no longer published. Right-click an item, the row labels. Filter, keep only selected items. That's not it either. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe I'm talking about doing it here. This might be the way. Let's record that and see what it does. All right, so let's do this. I've already got a pivot table here. I'm just going to go ahead and record myself hiding some of these. So let's suppose that what we're after here is we want all the data here in the pivot table, but I'm preparing a report that's just for like the Mountain West states. We're kind of comparing crime for the Mountain West states. So I want to hide all of these except for, should we say, Utah, Colorado, Washington, or I'm sorry, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. I don't know, some set here. So I'm going to record myself making that change. Macro 2 is fine. I'm going to just look for the code anyway. So yeah, I think what I want to do, come here, is unselect all of these. And let's just bring in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. That'll be good. We got 4 there. Say okay. And then maybe I'd actually like to expand Utah out. So, this is going to be my set that I'm comparing, but that's kind of how I want this pivot table to start out as. So let me go ahead and stop that. And we'll see what it recorded. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. Good. Okay, so it's setting a bunch of these to false. That's okay. That's what we're going to have to do. So it's not, I was hoping it might say, set them all false, and then that's what we did. Uncheck them all, and then let's check the ones we want. But it looks like it just set the ones to false that we didn't have checked. So yeah, Wyoming's just not here involved. Okay, so I really just want to bring this code in. So instead of ending this macro and starting this one, I'm going to just go ahead and cut out that part and make this all into one macro. And it's called pivot table 5 here, but now that's still my PT object. We'll just kind of go through and see what else it is that we're doing here. So we're doing a bunch of things to the state field. It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure why it does this, but it did a bunch of them. It ended the with. It started a new with, looking at exactly the same thing. So that with and end with doesn't need to be there. It's Wisconsin. I think we have to select number 8. And this one is saying show the details. So again, call this PT, show detail. That's going to show Utah. Now we just got to find a reasonable way to do all of these. I guess we could leave it just like this. But there's one thing I know about the data that we're working with is that we don't get all of the states. So I'm not sure that I should depend on any one of these states actually being here in the data set. So why don't we make a loop to look across all of them and either set it to false or not set it to false based on if it's in the set that we're after. Okay, so it looks like I can get after the pivot items of a particular pivot field. So I'm going to come back up to my top. I'll make another variable up here. Let me call it PI as a pivot item. So I've declared a new variable as a pivot item. And now let's just kind of go across all the pivot items of our pivot field. So let's do for each PI for each PI. I just forgot the syntax. Is it in? Yeah, in. For each PI in, and then we're after the state column, and we want the whole set of pivot items. So we'll be going across these one at a time. Debug.print PI dot name. Let me put a stop right here. So I think that should just go across all those, and it should print the names of all of my states. You run it to that point and just see what it does. Invalid or unique reference. Oh, this should say with. I deleted too much. Yeah, it's gone through and printed off all those names. So I can now kind of look at it right here, and I can say, hey, if the name of that is in the set that I want to keep, then I think it's already visible. So if it's not in the set that I want to keep, let's go ahead and get rid of it. So let's do this. We're going to say if, and let's use in string. Starting at 1, looking at something, looking for this name. If that is greater than 0, then it found it. Actually, if it's equal to 0, it didn't find it. Then we want to say PI dot visible equals false. And we just have to figure out what to put in here. So when we're looking at Alaska, when the name is Alaska, we want to know if that is in the set that we want to keep. So I think we just got to put the set that we want to keep right here. So that is Arizona, Utah. What else did I have? New Mexico. Colorado, Wyoming. What's that? Oh, you're saying new is going to show up multiple times and say, will that be a problem? And the answer is no, because I will be looking at a full state name. So I'll be looking at one of these here. So I'll say, I'll be saying, is New York, that's what the PI name will be, is New York in this string? And the answer is no. Now, I think the one time that this might be problematic is if we wanted to restrict to Virginia. Is that right? No, if I wanted to show West Virginia. So if I wanted to show like West Virginia and California, those are the only two, then I would, when I was looking at California, it would go, yep, that's right. When I was looking at West Virginia, it would go, yeah, that's right. When it's looking at Virginia, it would find it in this string as well. And so it would also be showing Virginia. Do we have any other case where we have a state that's the subset of another state's name? Kansas and Arkansas would have the same problem. Yeah. North and South Dakota, I don't think will, because the North or South will be included on it. But yeah, Kansas and Arkansas will have the same issue. So if I wanted to make that differentiation, I could do this. Let me, instead of having these separated by spaces, let me separate them by the pipe character, which is on my keyboard is right above the enter key. Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. For this set, it wouldn't be a problem. But if I was wanting to deal with some of those that we have subsets, where the state is a subset, that would be a problem. I'm going to put it on all the way surrounding it. And then let me just search for the thing I'm looking for. I'm going to concatenate backspace. I'm going to concatenate on the pipe on the front and back of this as well. So now I'm looking for pipe, Virginia pipe, and it wouldn't find pipe Virginia pipe, it would find pipe West Virginia pipe, but wouldn't find this one. Again, we don't really need these pipes in here to I think I got rid of a space here. To deal with the set that we're working with, but this would be a kind of a more general tool that would allow us to deal with some of the states that have names that would conflict with each other. Okay, so now I'll only be setting the ones to false that aren't in that set. Get rid of that. And then we are expanding out Utah. Looks pretty good. You go ahead and come back here and run that again, Control-Shift-P. Yeah, mission accomplished. We've got Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and then these are all expanded out. If I remember right, yeah, if we look at the arson column, we've had 5 arsons in this data set. University of Utah, nothing. It's a 5-0 score. What is that, like a popular family home evening activity or something? I just don't know. Let's go set fire on something. Okay. Anything else you want to look at in terms of pivot tables? I think I must be talking faster in my old age because this usually would take an hour and 15 minutes. Any other interesting challenges that you want to do with pivot tables? Yeah. Oh, let them pick it. Yeah. So that's definitely more than we can do in 15 minutes. But I think the right way to do that, yeah, probably come to kind of talk through what we might do. So at this point, we've got all the possible states right there. So we could use that information to fill a list box in a user form. And then essentially stop the code at this point, or at this point, kind of before we've actually done that. And then just display up the user form, maybe with pre-checking the ones that we think is a default set. Yeah. And as I think about that, I think this interface is so similar to what we're trying to build. Where is it? Right here? Yeah, I'm not sure that it makes sense for us to reduplicate what's already here, right? We could make a form that does this, but it's right here. So if we're saying, yeah, there's a set that we want to have picked, don't make the user do it. That's one thing, but yeah, I think if we're gonna let the user pick, let him pick it off the interface. Oh, right. Yeah. So we could make a choice that has those pre-built. And if we could kind of build the regions in ourselves. Yeah, that'd be a really great thing to do. All right, well, folks, let's call it good there then. Let's see. It seems like we should be coming up to where we're reviewing the midterm. Let me just take a look at the schedule real quick. Schedule. Is it the next time we get together or is it the following time? 16th, so a week from today. Okay, so we're getting started with the database stuff, and then we're gonna interrupt that. I think what I'm gonna do, I kind of want to put the database stuff together. Should I move the exam review to Monday? Or should I get you guys going on the database stuff so you can start working on the next project sooner and push the exam review to the following Monday? Push the exam. Who says push the exam review and let's get the database stuff going? Who says I'm itching to know what the results of the exam is? I said it looks like it's kind of slightly in favor of pushing. I'm going to push it one more day so that we're going to do our 2 database things. I'll do it right here. Next week, database will be done. Monday, we'll do the exam review. All right. Hang in there, folks who are wanting your exam review. It's coming. Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.